Publishing, the second in our 2015 series. We're very pleased that you can join us today. I'm Gerald Dullian, CEO at Allen Press, and your organizer for SSP's webinar program. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping items to cover. Your phone is muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the text chat feature and set it to organizers and panelists only to send in questions or to notify us if you are having technical difficulties. All questions will be saved until after all panelists have spoken. Please specify to which presenter you would like your question directed so our moderator can be sure to pose it to the correct presenter. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you will receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You will also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar and to the slides. Our moderator today is Barbara Chin. Barbara is Journals Director at JSTOR, managing publisher relationships and responsible for the strategic direction of its journal collections. She joined JSTOR in 2005 and works closely with librarians, faculty, and researchers to understand their content needs and to build products that address these needs. Prior to joining JSTOR, Barbara worked as an editor at Cambridge University Press, acquiring journals for the humanities and social sciences list. It is now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Barbara so she can introduce our panel and get us underway. Barbara?
Thank you, Gerald. It was fun to put this panel together, and I'm looking forward to the next hour when we will hear from three experienced and very accomplished professionals. We are lucky to have them for the next 60 minutes, so let's get started. Our first speaker, Aviva Weinstein, is Senior Associate Vice President of Account Management at Maverick and holds over 20 years experience in marketing and business development. She has spent the last 8 years focused on selling and marketing all aspects of digital content, including ebooks, databases, and e-journals. With extensive experience in growing businesses across all markets, Aviva currently works with Maverick's clients in publishing strategy, marketing, publisher relations, and sales. And so, Aviva, over to you.
Thanks so much. Hi there. Good morning. My name is Aviva Weinstein, and as Barbara mentioned, I'm a senior associate within the Maverick organization. I'm really excited to be able to join you today because my background is predominantly on the commercialization and creating commercial success for the publishing clients that Maverick works with. So this is something that I have a very strong affinity towards. A little bit on what I'm going to be covering off. It's a big world, and I think that we need to look at how to go about creating strategies that will work for your organizations in looking at the international markets. We'll look at how Maverick would recommend to its clients to go about identifying opportunities, what resourcing considerations you should have, how to go about developing the market, how to go about developing sales once the market opportunity is created, and then also some considerations with regards to the after-sales and customer care aspects of having an international customer base. I'm also hoping that we'll have enough time to cover off a couple of case studies just so that you could see sort of in real life how this is working out for a few of our clients. Just a bit about Maverick in case you're not familiar with us. We're about 6 years old now. In fact, we were established just a few weeks before the London Book Fair, which is on at the moment. 6 years ago. Our founder has been in the industry for a very long time, and I know quite a few people are familiar with him. His name is Martin Marlowe, but he always jokes that he turned his CV into a company. His background is very much in the traditional commercial areas, so product, publisher relations, sales management, and marketing from strategic down into the tactical rollout. And those, I would say, bridge beautifully to the key areas that we practice in. I'm giving you a bit of background on us just because it helps to sort of set the stage as to what it is that we as Mavericks do and therefore why you should be listening. That is a joke. So just a bit about who it is that we work with. Lovely splash of logos and even a better list of names. But we work with so many organizations within the industry. They'll come to us because they need help in developing strategic marketing, so more of the product marketing side of things. they'll want to look at specific markets and approaching those, either with a market development hat or going into actually helping them sell within markets, particularly where they don't have resources or expertise, down through helping them create new product offerings. And so quite often we'll work with these clients on creating strategies that will lead to supporting them with implementation where they have resourcing constraints. So that's sort of in a nutshell what we do. We're organized across 3 divisions, but 6 key service areas. So we have the strategic and operational marketing and production, and this will include things like market research, customer analysis, public relations, data gathering so that we can help clients create target lists of organizations they should be reaching out to and the likes. The technology, content, and production support side, where we'll work with clients at either not necessarily creating bespoke platforms, we'll work with the key platform providers there, but certainly customizing the interfaces that they have into their platforms, helping them identify content. We do a fair bit on mergers and acquisition there, and also helping them and supporting them when it comes to how they're going to deliver their content to market. And I say content because it's not just print that we're looking at. Certainly my background is predominantly on the e side of things, and we do a fair bit of support there. But more and more, we're working with our clients on helping them commercialize, so drive sales across markets. My accent's a bit deceptive. I actually work out of the United Kingdom, and my focus, for instance, is predominantly on the international markets. We do have a few other Mavericks that are U.S.-based who will focus on the U.S. and Latin American markets. For the most part, though, what we're offering our clients is business transformation best practice and the opportunity to go out and make as much as they can from the content that they have. From our perspective, and working across all of these clients means that we're able to go, right, we know this can work. We have seen this work. We recommend that you look at this, this, and this. And then we work with clients either on the implementation or just monitoring the progress once they've taken something on. Last year was a fantastic year for us. We delivered over 460 projects. Some of those are still current and live. We grew to about 90 associates, and we saw a huge amount of growth in the international and interim sales support that our clients were asking. It's definitely a growing area. A lot of our clients are looking to complement their own capabilities as well as bring on board additional revenue streams, which they're now seeing come to fruition. So if we look at creating an international sales strategy, it's not that dissimilar to creating a domestic U.S. sales strategy, except that there are a couple of considerations. So if you look at, identifying the opportunity, it's very much the same as you would approach any market. It involves market research. It involves identifying which markets are right for your organization's content, what the opportunities are in those markets, and creating that prospect list that you can then go out and develop. And some clients will choose to directly target them with sales. Other clients will look to warm up the opportunities with some marketing and some outreach campaigns. But again, it's very much dependent on the nature of the publisher, the type of content that they have, and how good the fit appears to be from testing the market out on their behalf. It also depends on the purchasing preferences. Different markets will acquire content differently. Some will prefer direct to institution. Some will prefer that you approach individuals within the organization and engage with them before coming to the, for instance, library. Others will prefer that you take it to an agent and that the agent feeds information to them. And the others will prefer either going through consortia or more of the big deal acquisition type of approaches. And each market is different. And so it's very important to understand what those purchasing preferences are before you approach the market. Probably not that dissimilar to the approaches that you have to different types of customers here in the United States. And then, of course, looking at what kind of models are best suited for the market and pricing as well, because there are pricing sensitivities, particularly in some of the developing markets. Resourcing, I'd say there are similarities in approach there because, again, in some instances, it's going to be very much about having direct resources put in place to be able to support those markets, bearing in mind that there are all sorts of considerations. But two key ones are going to be time differences and also language barriers. Whilst English is widespread across the world in its use, you will still come across people within institutions and also individuals where this creates a language barrier. And of course, there are sensitivities. Not everybody is comfortable speaking on the telephone in English. Sometimes they want somebody coming out to meet with them because they just pick up more signals off of reading them as they're interacting with each other. And so these are different considerations that we have to put into thinking when it comes to resourcing for sales in the international markets. A lot of work happens, I would say, across the Maverick clients on market development, and this is an area where I would say 95% of our clients look for our support, and generally we'll offer them a few different approaches. Campaigns are always very useful, especially if you can put them into native language or give people time before you do any follow-up, because obviously they need to be able to absorb the information that you're sending across. They're always best when they're followed with some form of outreach, generally not spam, but rather picking up a telephone and reaching out to people and asking if they've received information and starting to engage with them that way. It's definitely been very successful for two of the clients that I'll be covering off with you later in case studies. It does generate leads. It has been proven to generate leads. And it does help with some of the communications issues that you'd otherwise have, particularly on the time difference side of things, because it means you're not having to have somebody sat there cold calling from the start in order to create opportunities. On the sales development side of things, I think here, language barriers aside, it's probably identical to any other sales development that you would have anywhere else in the world. You know, you're still looking at lead conversion, you're still looking at negotiation, you're still going to have considerations when it comes to renewals. The one issue that you need to be aware of is that distance and time does make it challenging. Once, of course, you've sold in, you do need to consider customer care and the after-sales support, things like promotion of the resources that you have, either in print or electronic, training of people, and then also looking at where applicable usage, as well as the usual technical support queries that come in. I can't get to the content. What do I need to do here? And things like that. And those, again, fit into the resourcing considerations. So looking at growing markets, the first of the case studies, I wanted to point out a journals publisher. Unfortunately, I'm not able to say which of our clients, but if you go back, you might even be able to map it to them. They were looking at institutional sales growth specifically. They wanted it to be quite broad and then make it a bit more specific because they put in place a distribution partnership for the bulk of their international markets. And so it was more a matter of supporting their distribution partner as well as approaching the UK market very specifically. Areas that they looked for support were in creating prospect lists, creating some of those drip feed marketing campaigns that help to generate and stimulate interest, following those up with direct customer outreach, and then also, as I mentioned, providing agent channel support, not just to the distribution partner, but you know, they worked with probably 30 different subscription agents. Some would have 2 or 3 subs that they managed, others would have, you know, hundreds of subs that they managed. And what they were able to create in 2014 was 6-figure sales generation that they didn't have previously using this approach. But again, they had some very dedicated resources. They were very focused in on these markets, and that's how they were able to create it. The other publishers that I wanted to point out publish both journals and ebooks, and they were looking at institutional sales but to very specific markets. So their approach was somewhat different in that they went, right, let's do our research, let's identify where the best market opportunity is, and then let's go for it. So the first market they selected was Australia. They then also broadened it out to include the United Kingdom. They figured there was a better affinity to their content because they published in English only. And they were supported by Maverick in identifying the market, creating a prospect list, creating campaigns to generate interest. These generally went out to both the institutional library as well as academics within the institution. The academics were asked if they were interested to contact the organization, which they did. They then had a dedicated resource to help follow up on leads and take them through to closing opportunities. And we saw 4 subscribers in Australia within the initial campaign and continued ongoing market engagement in the United Kingdom. That also then led to them being able to approach the local consortia in Australia to begin looking at a national deal. And then within the rest of the international markets, we were asked to create some distribution partnerships for that client, which I know that they're continuing to develop. They generally, the indirect channels can take a bit longer than taking sales directly to the market. So that's, I believe, all of the time that I have. Thank you very much, and I know we'll have time for questions later. What I'd like to do is hand over to Bruce now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aviva. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and as she said, please enter any questions that you have, and we'll save them for the end of this webinar. I will allow Bruce some time to set up while I read a little bio of him. Bruce Hedrick is Vice President of Institutional Participation and Strategic Partnerships at Ithaca, where he has library outreach and business development responsibilities for JSTOR and Portico on a global basis. His team works with over 11,000 participating libraries in 163 countries around the world. He also works closely with commercial linking and discovery partners, web-scale discovery initiatives, and other library and publisher business ventures that interact with the JSTOR and Portico platforms. So with that, I hand it over to Bruce.
Thank you, Barbara. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here with you all. Following up on Aviva, I thought it would be useful to give a little practical example of where JSTOR has done some work in a particular country, basically growing from very little to having a fairly good presence. And I'm going to focus on our work in Turkey. And I thought it kind of highlights some of the things that Aviva was talking about in her framework, and I thought it would be useful to see just in a more practical sense how it's worked for us as a content aggregator. So while we're not a publisher per se at JSTOR, we do spend a lot of time researching these markets and doing deciding with our small amount of resources, which I'm sure many of you on this phone call have. We do not have a big sales team at JSTOR. We're pretty small, pretty lean. So it's really important for us to where we're going to do our work to make sure we're focusing those resources in the right way. And so we tend to do a lot of research ahead of time to see where we should be putting our efforts. And sometimes we don't guess exactly right, but for the most part we found that doing the research part has allowed us to have a much better success rate. So I encourage everyone on that front. JSTOR has been available as to institutions primarily in higher education for about 18 years now. The database sort of became live in 1997. I joined in 1999, and we've had some really strong growth internationally. Right now, JSTOR has just under 9,500 participating institutions around the world. But what most people don't know is that most of that participation is actually from outside the United States. We do have a lot of, obviously, penetration in the higher education market in the United States, but when you look at our penetration worldwide, it's right about 50%. It's higher in some countries than in others, but globally, we still see a lot of potential opportunity out there in the worldwide sort of higher education market, which is what I'm really focused on here is higher education. So Turkey is a good example for us because it kind of mirrors other situations we've had in other countries and gives some interesting notes of optimism and caution for people. And I think that I think one of the interesting things about working in any country is it can look like just a slam dunk win for a few years, and then if the economy shifts in a particular country, or your currency devalues, or you have some recession, all of a sudden that all that wonderful optimism you had the first few years begins to diminish. So another practical piece of advice is, if you can, have a long-term perspective on these things, because they tend to ebb and flow. So JSTOR got its first participant in Turkey in 1999, and that was fairly typical for us. We would see some institutions outside the U.S. and the U.K. and Canada begin to dabble into JSTOR. It was primarily as governments were funding mostly STM type of purchasing. They decided to throw a little bit toward the humanities and social sciences, and so you'd see a couple participants come in from research libraries in different countries, and that's kind of what happened with us in Turkey. And we kind of saw slow growth of that through 2004. We began to look at Turkey because we could see it was an emerging economy, and of course they were in the throes of deciding whether to basically apply for full membership in the EU. And when that became a strategic goal of the government, we sort of thought that coming away from that would be a larger investment in higher education in the country. So we were sort of looking at those external trends in a certain way to try to figure out when the time was right. That small participation base that we had good usage, so we knew that while most everything in JSTOR was primarily English-based, that it was getting good use amongst those small number of institutions in Turkey. So we knew that there was a call for that content in some sense. We looked at the higher education system in Turkey. We knew that it was a fairly decent size, and that it was getting government backing, and that it was growing, which was you don't see a lot of countries where you actually see new higher education institutions growing up, and some of the emerging economies you do. But when you get in a lot of the countries that have been around, where higher education systems have been in place for quite some time, you actually see more consolidation than you're seeing growing. So that was a bit of an unusual thing. So this is kind of, if you were to chart our participation in Turkey, you'd kind of see it's kind of just slowly growing. We weren't doing anything in particular. We certainly, at this time in our sales effort, we maybe had 2 people working at JSTOR. So Turkey certainly was not on our radar screen as a high priority. So so this was just sort of happening, through viral marketing, professors talking to each other, institutions talking to each other. So when I look at the next set of time between 2005 and 2011, this is when we started to see the government actually provide some funding to institutions. They had made the case to the government that they would like to get one or more JSTOR collections, and government decided to fund some of that. So these institutions came to us, and their preference was to work through the consortium that had been started there in Turkey called ENKOS, which many of you are familiar with. So we started actually working with ENKOS at that time, 2005, and at that point we saw a fairly big bump in participation. And the ENKOS group has been very good to work with in that time period, and they were excited because they had started out with mostly STM type of products, and so having a humanities and social sciences product was they were excited about as well. So it was a nice partnership, and we saw that participation grow fairly nicely during that time period when we first started working with ENKOS. So you can see we had some years with new participation was pretty strong, and our overall participation continue to grow. So in 2011, we actually attended our first ANCOS meeting. So we had been working with ANCOS for 5-6 years, and it wasn't until 2011 that we went to an actual meeting. And that was a very, very beneficial thing for us. It actually proves to you what you learn every single day, was when you actually get a chance to get in front of a group of librarians, a group of institutions who know you, but you haven't had a chance to interact with face-to-face before. It's a very positive thing. And so being at that meeting, actually, we began to see more new participation, and other collections begin to be licensed. We have been to that meeting every year since then. It was such a positive experience. We also found that it was important to have some consistency in your visibility in that particular country. So it's not good. We found it not to be a very good practice to go, to not be there for a few years and come back. That inconsistency sometimes has two problems. One, it's out of sight, out of mind, and the other is that the librarians and the institutions in that country sometimes are not sure how committed you are in there, and it can create some barriers. So we decided it was really important for us, because we saw Turkey as being a very strong place next to India in the way that we've divided the world. They had the most potential for growing revenue, and the participation interest there was really strong, but we had big language barriers. We at the time did not have anyone on our staff who was comfortable in Turkey speaking the language, and we certainly knew that that having an agent was going to help us as far as those institutions processing their invoices. What we bump into often is in certain countries is that it's important for them to use a licensing agent, because just for the processing of their invoices, because it's a really illegal issue of trying to process things in U.S. dollars as opposed to the currency of that country. So we decided engaging with an agent was going to be really important for our long-term success in Turkey. So we issued an RFP at the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, and we had 3 respondents, and we chose Easy Solutions in Turkey, and they sort of began in earnest really in the second quarter of 2013. And they've been very helpful for us as far as managing those language barrier issues, building awareness of JSTOR amongst people, non-research libraries, and actually helping us build relationships with the individual institutions. You can get connected with agents sometimes who want to own that relationship and want to be the focal point of that, but we've found where we have the most success is where the agents are able to connect us with institutions, and we are able to have some of those strong relationships ourselves. So if you go up through where we are today, our participation has kind of fallen, new participation has fallen off over the last couple, just because the economy and the political situation in Turkey has made it very difficult. But we also haven't had institutions withdraw, which we've maintained our participation base, which has been good in this turmoil. So we, taking a long-term perspective, are really excited about where Turkey can go. We have about, from our estimation, about 70% market penetration into Turkey amongst the higher education institutions, which is good. And we certainly have a lot of other possibilities that exist in Turkey, but we really think this is an economy that is going to continue to grow over time, and so we're very, very happy with where our standing is right now. I'll just say one last thing, and that is that there's a lot of benefits to working with a local agent, but you have to be realistic about this. For many of these agents, they're representing multiple products, multiple publishers, so how you're able to set expectations and how you're able to manage those agents is really important. I can't tell you the amount of time and money that we spend in managing the handful of agents that we have, because we very much see them as an extension of our own organization. So there's a lot of work that we put in to making them understand what JSTOR is, what its mission is as a not-for-profit, why it's different from some of the other things that are out there. And that's challenging when you have agents who have sales representatives who are motivated by, what is selling the most, where do I get the most commission, that sort of thing. And so I think setting expectations properly when you decide to go into a country is really, really important. And if you decide to use a licensing agent, be careful to manage the challenges that you're going to have as well. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Caitlin and give this over to her. Thank you very much.
And as Caitlin sets up, let me introduce her to our attendees. Caitlin Meadows is Publishing Services Director of the Charlesworth Group, providing publishing and marketing services for scholarly publishers globally and access to Western academic content for libraries and consortia in China. She supports clients, colleagues, and industry partners across 5 major regions: Europe, North America, South America, India, and the Far East. And so with that, I will let Caitlin jump in.
Hello, thank you. Good to talk to everybody today. As Barbara just suggested, I'm going to be talking about China as a country study. Charlesworth has been working in the Chinese market for around about 15 years now. I've been with the company for about 18 years, so in one small way I can say that I predate China. But it's been interesting for me to see the developments in terms of publishing, sales opportunities within the market over that time. And so what I want to do today is share those perspectives, share some insights from publishers, but also give you some insights into some of the developments that are happening within publishing in China, which hopefully will give you a few pointers in terms of developing your own publishing programs or looking at where content streams and revenue streams might come from in the near future. So we know China is a rapidly growing market. That's not new news, I think, to anyone. I think really what has been quite extraordinary with China is the rapidity of that growth, and that's essentially happened over the last 10 to 15 years. More recently, funding from the central Chinese government has really spearheaded development in infrastructure and growth and expansion of actually English language titles which are published within China. And actually, as much as we like to think about Western titles gaining revenue, gaining authors from China, it's very much working also in the other direction, from east to west. I think there are opportunities in terms of collaboration in co-publishing and also in the development of publishing services and author services. And as we start to see an unfolding interest in publishing and open access journals, I think that becomes increasingly important. So working with publishers over the last 15 or so years, the most common assertions that I will tend to hear will be this mismatch between submissions and subscriptions, and sometimes there may be problems in terms of the quality of the submissions. But I think a lot of publishers would like to see a parity of subscriptions compared to their submissions, and that's not always the case. There may be decisions that publishers have to make in terms of to go with a particular consortium or not. There are some very large consortia in China, the bigger consortia, MSCL and CALIS, still acquire new content, but have been quite acquisitive over the last few years, particularly in medical sciences. And for some publishers, the best revenue streams may be by going direct to smaller consortia or individual subscriptions. I'll talk more about Tier 1 and Tier 2 and corporate subscriptions, but essentially Tier 1 is the top level of universities within China, those with the biggest budgets and the best infrastructures. And that's a very demarcated market sector, in fact. I think a lot of publishers now are asking us more about open access potential, APCs, and I'll give some more facts and figures around open access developments in China later on. If you're a society publisher, you may also be wanting to increase your membership. So in actual fact, in terms of services within China that we're seeing a lot more take-up of, for example, help desks to help local Chinese members, or to help publishers to actually increase their membership within China. Some publishers would say that they may see flatlining or market saturation, where they've managed to sell into the bigger raft of institutions or by consortia, and then maybe looking at different content streams, perhaps ebook collections, perhaps it's reprints if you're a medical publisher looking at the opportunities presented by selling to the pharmaceutical sector. This graph on my next slide shows how China, the second line down, is really increasing its R&D spending. And actually quite interesting, this graph could quite easily also indicate the rise in submissions to Western journals. So as R&D spending increases, equally so does authorship and readership, and therefore potential users. There was a quite extraordinary increase actually in terms of the number of authors publishing in Western journals, nearly 20% in 2014 compared to 2013. And China's total expenditure, a rise of around about 23% year on year over the last 10 years, which is quite extraordinary. We often think of China being a big country, but in actual fact it isn't. Even in some of the more general scientific disciplines, what you'll actually find is most of the larger universities and institutions are geared towards the east of the country. The top 10 universities that I've shown on this slide are really almost exclusively over in the east. I think my main point here would be that it's important to know within your discipline what the key institutions are. There's no point having a scattergun approach to sales and marketing strategy. You've really got to know where the key institutions are and ensure that you do target your marketing and sales efforts for that. And I think that's where local agents, local expertise really does come into the equation. I wanted to talk about Project 211. Project 211 is a government-organised initiative which has been formed to inject budget and development into national key universities. It was actually started in 1995, but there are actually currently 113 universities, and it's a public list, but I think it's important to know who these universities are and know which are key within your particular discipline, because that will be the top tier of the institutions to which you would be targeting your main subscriptions. I mentioned earlier about the demarcation between Tier 1 and Tier 2. I think there are still opportunities for the Tier 2 market, i.e. those institutions which have lower budgets. Print subscriptions are more prevalent. What we're also seeing now is more of a take-up with what we call like low-cost online subscriptions. So a model whereby a publisher can actually sell to these institutions, but with, for example, limited IP access, so they can gain some penetration into that market whilst not necessarily giving the baby away with the bathwater in terms of revenue. And it'd be quite interesting actually to see how Project 211 and the development of those institutions actually changes the publishing landscape in China. But I think it's also worth looking at some of the future trends in terms of China's own 5-year plan. We're actually in the 5th year of the 12th 5-year plan. And the government had earmarked 7 key industries for particular investments, and those are listed here on this slide. I think it's quite interesting to see how there is a focus on, for example, biomaterials, newer technologies, nanotechnology, and also environmental studies. I haven't mentioned it so much here, but actually if you're a medical publisher, developments around chronic diseases related to the environment and also perhaps the Western diet, diabetes, obesity, stroke, COPD, those are all increasing as well. And I just think it could be interesting if you're a publisher thinking about launching new journals, taking note of some of these burgeoning areas. It's an incredibly simple point to make in some ways, that the Chinese speak a different language, of course, but actually it's much more subtle than that. I think in a lot of disciplines, certainly in research areas, English will be well spoken. In certain more practitioner-led subject areas, you may actually find that English isn't widely spoken. Some examples that we found, nursing, for example, or engineering. And I think the other thing to note is that sometimes people will have a very good understanding of English and terms related to their own discipline, but not necessarily related to publishing. And I think that very much influences how you actually target the market in terms of what you would decide to translate or not translate, how you would use those tools, and how you can either reach out directly as the publisher or use local experts, whether that's agents, people on the ground, editorial board members, etc., in reaching out to the audience. Key, obviously, in terms of actually selling is raising brand awareness. I think local language material is vitally important, and it's important to understand what best to translate. Something we do find actually is social media is great for engagement, particularly with authors. But what I would also say is that if you can translate key resources like your notes for contributors, that's often essential in being able to reach out to the authors and get the best quality submissions. It's interesting to note, actually, in terms of social media, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter are blocked, but Weibo and WeChat are the big services that are used in China, and in fact, collectively have more registered users than Twitter does globally. But I put a point here about local language websites because I think this is important. You don't necessarily have to translate your entire website, but translating key resources to enable them to be searched on the local Google, which is Baidu, can bring many benefits and enrich SEO and the potential for readers and potential purchasers to find your content. Attending conferences, being there in person, developing your own relationships is really important. Also, if you can give goodwill events such as engagement with authors in seminars on how to publish in journals can be extremely valuable and a way to network. I mentioned earlier about author services, but what we're seeing as well is more of an uptake from publishers in things like help desk services for authors. The Chinese love to be on the phone, something I certainly noticed when I traveled to visit my colleagues, and I think that's something that you have to take into consideration when you're reaching out to, whether that's subscribers or potential authors. And I think as this represents a kind of author-centric approach, that's even more important for publishers who have open access titles. But equally, too, if you're a society, as I mentioned earlier, membership campaigns, market research campaigns to find out what the readers really want, that's vital, and it's vital that's done in the right way whether that's through email outreach or telephone surveys. And we've actually found telephone surveys have been very useful when we've done market research projects for publishers. So here are examples of a couple of tweets. As I say, a great way to engage, particularly with authors, but also librarians. Open access, some mandates were announced in China back in May 2014, and so there is now an acknowledgement and a support for green open access within China. What we're also seeing is that grant funding is increasingly being made available to authors to publish in Western academic journals and actually support the APCs that are required to do that. And I think this is only going to increase, and I know a number of open access journals have seen a real proliferation over the last couple of years in terms of submissions from China. Actually, another part of our business, we offer a language editing service. It's quite interesting. A few years ago, we found that the Chinese were quite resistant to pay sort of market rates, if you like, for those sorts of services, and that's starting to change. So really, we're starting to see budgets infiltrate right down to the author level. Co-publishing opportunities as well. As much as we want to reach out to the East, that is happening in equal measure in the opposite direction. We've seen some success for publishers through co-publishing arrangements. There's a challenge in terms of obtaining an ISSN in China. So there are some ways around this, whether that's co-publishing or whether that's actually to engage with a potential sponsor. That we tend to see more in the medical sector in terms of pharmaceutical sponsorship, but equally it can happen in terms of engagement between one society and perhaps a local Chinese equivalent. So what we talk about is essentially the China footprint of really just looking at what your impact is on and with China. So pulling all the strands together and however develop your market outreaches in China, looking at your sales, looking at online usage, including turnaways, looking at your editorial board members, looking at your authors, being out there, attending meetings, making sure that you have materials that are published in Chinese if that is relevant to your market. Making sure that if you have local staff there that you have on the ground or trusted contacts and partners that you can work with to get that direct outreach, but also look at how you can support the authors and look at your reputation, discuss with editorial board members and authors and subscribers, how do they view you? How do they view you against the competition? And in China, I love the word guangxi, which is essentially it's about relationship, it's about network, and it's about reciprocal benefit. And I think that really does kind of summarize the best approach to take. It's about building relationships, east to west and west to east. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Now is the time for some questions for our panelists. So I will ask all of the panelists to unmute yourself. And the first question I have, all of you have shared some of your success stories with us and some of the strategies you employed to meet those success. But are there countries or regions where it has just been too difficult to penetrate and perhaps not worth the efforts? All of you talked about resources and the time that it takes to get those success stories, but are there any countries or regions where it might not be worth it?
If it's okay, I'll jump in now. I think that, there are certainly developing world countries where the budgets just don't exist or are so minimal that, publishers can go into battle for very, very little return. And they tend to be the ones that are included in some developing world opportunities, such as the INASP or IFL collections. And I think there, it's a good opportunity to leverage those types of I wouldn't even call them consortia, but opportunities, because it is a way of seeding the market at the time that those economies do start to grow at least you know that you have some usage that you're able to go and potentially make changes later on. But, you know, there are markets that you can spend an awful lot of time, energy, and make a significant investment, but see minimal return otherwise. And those, both in Aspen Eiffel, for instance, will list out all of those countries. Another good resource is looking at, you know, the World Bank and some of the economic indicators there to help identify where there are developing countries that are seeing more or less growth. But generally, if the economy looks very bad in an undeveloped or an underdeveloped country, the opportunity isn't really there.
This is Bruce. I can think of a few countries where we've struggled. JSTOR is a little maybe more unusual because we actually have a Developing Nations African Access Initiative where we provide free access to the entire continent of Africa and about a dozen other countries that are sort of in that World Bank lowest tier. I think it's more. I would focus a little more on what are some of the pitfalls you can run into. Obviously, you're looking for stability in some sort. If you want to make an investment in a country, I'll use Russia for our example. We had worked with a foundation years ago to actually seed participation in Russia amongst the research institutions. And frankly, over the last 10 or 15 years since that seeding happened, we haven't seen a lot of growth in Russia. We'd see it go up and we'd see it go down based on what's happening in the economy. And so I think it depends what your goals are as an organization. If you're looking to, you know, get your content out and that's really what your focus is, you know, working with folks like in Aspen Eiffel and others is a very valuable route to go. If you're looking for consistency of revenue, I think it's really, you have to be really careful about looking at the long term, where you're focusing your limited resources. I would also say, in this day and age, I'd be very careful about putting all your eggs into a consortial basket. It is it's as challenging for consortia as it is for publishers in many instances, and they're battling for their own sort of existence, especially the ones that are really focused more as buying clubs than as sort of funded organizations on behalf of the institutions or on behalf of the government. So I think you have to do be careful looking at the consortia, because you don't want to be in a place where you put all your eggs in that consortia and all of a sudden they lose their funding or they, you know, the government decides not to go that route anymore, and then you're left without any relationships with the institutions themselves. And I would just caution everybody on that. It's a difficult time for consortia right now too, so be very careful there.
Hello, it's Caitlin here. I mean, I can only really comment in terms of our experience in China. We're not currently doing similar services in other territories, although that's certainly something that we do keep our focus on. And I think in terms of, you know, where we would look to do that would be areas where, you know, you do see some stability, that you see obvious development in terms of funding institutionally, but also infrastructure. I think the actual infrastructure of a country is important. I mean, in terms of China, actually being able to get around China is relatively easy. You have to be realistic sometimes in terms of you know, meetings, how many meetings you can actually fit in a day, in terms of distances between locations, even within individual cities. But certainly stability is a particular factor. What I would say in terms of our experience in China for publishers and just looking at actual sort of content and subject areas that will sell well, I mean, I mentioned about developing technologies, but we still find it's a challenging market for publishers in the humanities, social sciences. Political science can be a challenging subject area, but also more abstract disciplines So that's certainly somewhere where we tend to have to manage publishers' expectations in terms of, you know, the market development and how long that might actually take.
Okay, great. Thank you for those answers. Another question for all of you. What are some techniques that we can use to ensure communication is open when the distance is great and travel might not be possible when third parties are present? Anyone want to take that one?
Well, this is Bruce again. I'll just go back to my earlier point. You have to be prepared to make a commitment. You know, there's a difference between commitment and engagement. If you're engaged, you know, you're kind of tracking what's going on. If you're committed, we spend a considerable amount of resources to make sure we go, that we engage with the licensing agents in those countries on a regular basis, and I mean twice a year, to make sure that their sales forces are up to date on what we're doing and what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it, and to work with them on creative solutions that they have found in working directly with the institutions themselves. So I just think, you know, you can't just like sign up a third party and kind of hope for the best. You have to be prepared to put some money and time into it yourself to make sure that they're representing you the best way, the way that you actually want them to.
I would agree with Bruce. I think more often than not we find that when clients are coming to Maverick and they've set up these third-party relationships, they've not made the investment in training them and reinforcing what their offering is. And it is about having time with them and making sure, even if you can't physically travel to be with them, but offering webinars to keep them informed about not just the product offering, but the after-sales support and care, what the key selling points are, what makes the content unique, because otherwise they have so much in their portfolio, it's very difficult to get mind share from them.
Caitlin, do you have an answer for that too?
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with those points. I think even if you have, you know, local agents or staff on the ground who are your people, you know, dealing with the institutions, dealing with those relationships on the ground level, there is nothing like you as a publisher yourself going to the country, visiting. It is exactly about engagement, and it's about keeping that relationship going. So not just going once and then kind of leaving it to unroll. You have to keep up that commitment, absolutely.
Okay. I think
Barbara,
yep.
Can I just, this is Bruce, can I make one more point? I think it's important, people who've been doing this know this, but sometimes local agents are almost like a real estate agent in the United States. They represent both parties. So, you know, sometimes they're representing your products and services, but they're also having to make sure that they keep their relationship intact with the consortium or the set of institutions they're working with for other products and services that they're selling. So you have to push sometimes to get your stuff to be to get, you know, a pricing that you want, or a particular a part of a license agreement squared away, because it sometimes is a friction for the licensing agent to push too hard on the consortium or the institutions you're working with, because they have to maintain that relationship.
Okay, thank you, Bruce, and actually thank you to all of our panelists as we are out of time. They will be happy to answer any questions that you might have if you want to contact them. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of the questions, but I just want to give a last thank you to our panelists, and also to all of the attendees for giving up the last hour of your time, which I hope was instructive, informative, and we hope to see you again at some of the other SSP webinars that we have in the future. Thank you.